She came looking for answers about her father's disappearance. What she found was a buried body, a town built on lies, and a truth they tried to burn. This is the story of how I uncovered everything they wanted to forget. A shocking revelation comes next. But before we uncover the truth that shook the entire frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss more stories like this, where one decision can change everything. The envelope felt like it had traveled through a war to get to me, creased, yellowed, its corners softened as if too many hands had hesitated to drop it in a mailbox. I found it wedged between an old power bill and a pizza menu. No return address, just my name written in an unfamiliar slant that made my stomach fold in on itself. Inside was a single photograph, cracked at the corners, and I didn't need to flip it over to know who it was. My father, smiling with that boyish squint I hadn't seen in 17 years. The same shirt he wore the day he vanished. The same look in his eyes, like he was about to say something he never got the chance to. My hands shook, not from fear, but from recognition, from a memory I had buried, like bad evidence in the back of my mind. I turned the photo over, and in black ink too fresh for time to have faded, was the sentence that cracked something wide open inside me. "You're not done looking. No signature, no date." Just that one line and a postmark, stamped from a place called Black Hollow, which sounded more like a warning than a town. I Googled it, of course. A blink, and you miss it blip in the mountains. Population under 200. No social media presence, not even a Yelp review. I stared at the name on the screen, and the longer I looked, the more it felt like it was staring back. I tried to dismiss it, tried to tell myself it was a prank, a scam. Someone messing with the daughter of the man who'd been declared legally dead a decade ago. But when I closed my eyes, I saw his face again. Not the cleaned-up version I kept framed on my bookshelf. The real one. The tired one. The one who whispered, "Be brave," when I was 6 and thunder cracked through our roof. That man didn't just walk away. That man didn't vanish on purpose. And now, someone wanted me to know he hadn't gone far enough. I stayed up until morning. The photos spread out like a crime scene on my kitchen table. My laptop opened to grainy satellite images of Black Hollow, each pixel pulling me deeper into the gravity of whatever it was I had tried not to chase for almost 2 decades. I thought I had come to terms with the silence, built my quiet little life around not knowing, patched the wound with work and good manners and crossword puzzles. But the second I held that picture, I knew I was never finished, that something was unfinished, that the story I thought had ended was just the first chapter. I booked a one-way bus ticket before the sun rose, packed a bag with my father's old journal, 3 cassettes he mailed me when I was 10, and the flashlight I kept for blackouts. I didn't leave a note. I didn't tell anyone. This was a whisper I had to follow alone. The attic had always smelled like mothballs and dried roses, but now it held a silence that felt more alive than dead, like something waiting, curled up in the rafters just beyond sight. After Grandma passed, I told myself I'd come up here to sort through boxes for donation, but the truth is, I came hunting for ghosts. For the kind of paper trail that doesn't show up in court filings or police reports. Dust clung to everything like memory, thick and undisturbed, and I moved slowly, pulling back old sheets that revealed trunks filled with brittle photographs and newspaper clippings that had yellowed into secrets. The third box in the corner looked different, military gray and locked tight with a rusted latch that groaned when I pried it open using the claw end of a hammer. Inside, time sat folded and packed like it had been waiting just for me. There were hand-drawn maps with circles scribbled in red ink, each one marked with the same initials, T.H. My father's handwriting, precise and looping, stared back at me from the margins of a weather-stained journal, its spine cracked but still proud. I flipped through pages soaked in fear, sketches of places he had traveled to, lists of names with some crossed out, others underlined twice. Then I found the cassettes. 3 of them. Each labeled in his handwriting, numbered in pencil like breadcrumbs. I stood there, stunned, holding them like they were relics from a religion I hadn't practiced in years. I dusted off Grandma's old tape player, praying the batteries hadn't corroded into powder. When I pressed play, it whirred to life with a hiss, and then his voice filled the attic, my father's voice. Older, raspier, but unmistakably his. He sounded like he was speaking from inside a tunnel, like every word cost something. He talked about people following him, about something buried that should have stayed that way, about how he couldn't run anymore because running only led back to the same place. He said my name once, so softly it almost broke me. Said if I ever heard this, it meant the wrong people had found the right thing, that if I listened, I had to keep listening. That silence was dangerous. I sat on the attic floor for hours, rewinding and re-listening, trying to make sense of every pause, every breath. The words didn't give answers, not the kind I could hold, but they opened a door I couldn't close again. That metal box wasn't just a container. It was a coffin for the truth. My father hadn't vanished because he was lost. He disappeared because he had found something. And now, with the maps rolled under my arm and his voice still echoing in my ears, I knew I had to go to the place where his trail went dark. Whatever Black Hollow was hiding, it had been hiding it long before he got there. But I was going to find it, one circle at a time. The bus coughed its way up the winding roads like it didn't want to reach the top, groaning at every turn until the mountains finally opened up to reveal Black Hollow, a town that looked like it had been dipped in sepia and forgotten by time. The main street was only a few blocks long, lined with buildings that leaned on each other like old men sharing secrets, their paint peeling, their windows too clean. A carved wooden sign hung crooked at the edge of town, welcoming me in a font that tried too hard to be friendly. The driver didn't speak when I stepped off, didn't wait to see if anyone would greet me. He just closed the doors and disappeared back down the hill, like someone escaping a place he'd rather forget. I stood alone on the cracked sidewalk, my boots crunching over salt and old pine needles, and the silence wasn't peaceful, it was watching. A woman in a floral apron swept the porch of a general store and froze when she saw me, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I asked if she knew where I could find the sheriff, and she pointed without a word, then turned back to her, sweeping like I had never existed. The sheriff's office sat beside a church with a caved-in steeple, its door propped open by a stone painted to look like an apple. Inside, it smelled like lemon oil and dust, like someone was trying too hard to convince you everything was normal. Sheriff Eldon Maris looked like he'd been carved out of old barnwood and stitched into a uniform. He smiled as I walked in. But it was the kind of smile that measured more than it welcomed. Said he'd heard someone new was coming through. Said he hoped I wasn't here to stir up old stories. I told him I was looking for information about my father, Reverend Thomas Hewitt. His smile didn't change, but his eyes hardened just enough for me to see it. He offered me coffee in a chipped mug and asked how long I was planning to stay. I told him until I found what I was looking for. He laughed once, dry and flat, then leaned back in his chair and said, "Folks around here didn't take well to people digging in the past." I wanted to tell him I wasn't here to dig. I was here to exhume. But I nodded politely, the way I had been taught, and thanked him for his time. As I stepped out onto the porch again, the wind picked up and carried with it the smell of smoke that wasn't there a minute ago. I looked back once and saw him watching me through the blinds, still smiling, still unmoved. Black Hollow wasn't welcoming me, it was warning me, and I wasn't sure if I had just walked into a town or a trap. Either way, I wasn't turning back. The diner sat at the end of the road, like it had been built out of the leftover pieces of another town. Its neon sign flickering half dead, and its windows fogged by time and grease. Inside, the booths were cracked vinyl, and the air smelled like burnt coffee and old bacon. But the place was full of people who talked too low and stared too long. I sat at the counter because it felt safer than turning my back. The waitress, a thin woman with swollen ankles and lipstick on her teeth, asked if I was passing through or staying for trouble. Before I could answer, a voice 2 stools down said my name. Not Miss, not Hey You, but Clara, like it had weight. I turned and saw him. Walter Knox. Corduroy jacket, hands like bark, and eyes that had seen too much. He looked at me the way people look at headstones they recognize. He said he knew my father. Didn't ask, didn't wonder, knew. I asked how, and he just smiled without his mouth, like the answer was too big for the room. He said I had his eyes, that Thomas talked about me often, that he never stopped hoping I'd come. When I pressed him, he waved the waitress over and asked for more coffee, then changed the subject so quickly it gave me whiplash. Said winters were colder now, said kids didn't know how to chop wood, said things used to grow better before the ground went wrong. I asked again, firmer, what he knew about my father, and he said nothing good ever comes out after dark. Then he stood, tossed a 5 on the counter, and told me to be careful who I trusted, especially those who smiled too easily. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind howled like it was dragging secrets across the rooftops, and the air was thick with something unsaid. Around midnight, I wrapped my coat tighter and walked out, needing air or answers, or maybe both. I wandered past the church ruins, through the trees, and toward the cemetery that sat hunched behind a wrought iron fence. That's when I saw him, Walter, digging. No flashlight, no coat, just him and a shovel, moving dirt like it owed him something. I stayed in the trees, half hidden by branches, heart thudding like a drum in a tight room. He worked slowly, methodically, like he'd done it before, like he wasn't afraid of being caught. I wanted to shout, to ask what he was doing, but something in me knew better. The kind of knowing that doesn't come from logic but blood. I watched until he stopped, covered whatever hole he had made, and stood there with his head bowed, lips moving like prayer or regret. Then he walked away without looking back, leaving behind a patch of disturbed earth and 100 new questions that would not let me rest. Something was buried, and not just in the ground. The church looked like it had been struck by lightning and then abandoned by God himself, its skeleton blackened and slumped inward, the bell tower a hollow throat that would never sing again. I stepped through what used to be the front doors, now splintered and hanging from rusted hinges, and the scent of ash still lingered in the air like a ghost that didn't know it was dead. Charred pews lay toppled like bones in a collapsed rib cage, and the stained glass windows were nothing but jagged mouths in the wall, their colors melted into puddles of sorrow on the floor. Dust floated in the light that slanted through the cracks above, and every step I took sounded too loud, like the floorboards were warning something that I had arrived. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that my father had once stood at this altar, had once raised his voice in this space, had once believed in something that this place tried to destroy. I found the pulpit on its side, half buried beneath a beam, and beside it, a warped photo album with its leather cover split and curling. I lifted it gently, my gloves smudging soot across the pages, and inside were photos too familiar to be coincidence. My father, standing before a full congregation, smiling, preaching, holding a Bible in one hand and a baby in the other. Someone had taken these photos with care, framed them with intent, then left them here to burn like they wanted the past to scream. I turned to the last page, and a folded slip of paper dropped out, its edges scorched, its ink blurred but still legible. It was his handwriting, sharp and looping. I knew it like I knew my own. 3 lines only. I should never have come back. They said it would be different. It never island. I sat down hard on a step where the choir might have once stood, the note trembling in my hand, my breath catching like it had tripped over the silence. My father hadn't just been here. He had tried to leave a message behind, a warning tucked into the ashes. The fire had come twice, I was told, once in 1991 and again in 2008, both times blamed on faulty wiring. Both times followed by the same shrugs from the townspeople and the same silence from the sheriff's office. But now I was beginning to think fire wasn't an accident here. Fire was a language. And someone had been speaking it fluently for years. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket, my eyes drifting to the pulpit again, to the way it leaned like it still carried the weight of someone who had stood too long trying to be heard. Whatever my father found in this town, it was enough to set something ablaze, and I had a feeling it wasn't the church he meant to burn. It was the girl with the mismatched braids who said it, her voice barely louder than the rustle of wind through the dry leaves, as if the orchard itself might overhear. She was no older than 10, dirt on her knees and eyes too old for her face. I had passed her near the general store when she looked up from drawing chalk shapes on the sidewalk and said, almost like it was a dare, that if I wanted to know where the dead things slept, I should follow the path behind the peach grove and stop where the air felt wrong. I tried to ask her what she meant, but she just blinked and went back to her drawing, her fingers smudging a stick figure with no head. So later that day, I walked out past the church ruins and took the long dirt road that curved behind the orchard, past the trees that hadn't borne fruit in years. The branches were twisted like they were trying to hold each other up, and the ground felt uneven, like it remembered being dug. I followed the trail until I reached a clearing choked with weeds and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from warning. I used the small spade I had brought from Grandma's shed, not sure what I expected, maybe old tools or broken bottles, maybe nothing at all. But after a few minutes, my blade struck something that wasn't rock, something smooth and pale and curved in a way I immediately recognized from too many documentaries and late-night internet rabbit holes. I pulled it free, and there it was in my palm. A femur, human. I didn't need a lab to tell me that. The marrow channel, the shape, the size. It wasn't ancient either. It hadn't been there long enough to forget who it belonged to. Before I could even decide what to do, a crunch of gravel behind me made me turn. Sheriff Mara stood just a few yards away, like he'd been waiting for his cue. He said he was out on a walk, like we were neighbors, and this was just a nice evening. His eyes flicked to the bone in my hand, and for the first time, his smile didn't reach his face at all. He took slow steps forward, nodding, said it looked like an animal bone, maybe a deer. I said nothing, just watched as he reached into his coat, pulled out a handkerchief, and took the femur like he was picking up litter on a sidewalk. He turned it over once in his hand, then slipped it into his pocket like it wasn't something sacred or damning, just something inconvenient. He told me to be careful digging out here alone, that the ground could collapse in on itself if I wasn't gentle. Then he walked off, whistling low and tuneless, leaving me in a clearing that now felt like a crime scene where the killer had just straightened the chairs. I found Walter sitting on the same rusted bench behind the diner, his boots caked in dried mud and his eyes fixed on nothing, like the world had finally tired him out. He didn't look up when I sat beside him, didn't flinch when I said his name, just lit a cigarette with hands that trembled like old leaves in wind. The silence between us stretched long and tight, but I didn't speak first. I waited. I'd learned that much in Black Hollow. Let the quiet hang, and someone always filled it. He took a long drag and exhaled slow, the smoke curling like something escaping, then said, almost like he was telling it to the ground, that trees didn't grow so well in the orchard anymore. Said the roots hit things they shouldn't, bones, boxes, stone that wasn't rock. I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head, the kind of shake that says you already know. He looked at me then, finally, and his face had collapsed into something smaller, like he'd been carrying weight he could no longer lift. "They never stopped digging out there," he said. "But your daddy—" He dug too deep. His voice broke in the middle of that sentence, and when I reached out, he flinched like I was fire. "He found something," he said. "Or someone, maybe both, and they told him to leave it be." He dropped the cigarette, crushed it with the heel of his boot, and added, "He wouldn't." So they made sure he couldn't dig again. I felt the blood drain from my fingers, the words hitting harder than a slap, and still he kept going. "Your father asked questions no one else dared to. About the children, about the money, about what lies under this town like rot under the floorboards." He turned toward me, his eyes glassy and far away. He thought the church would protect him, thought the truth had teeth. But in Black Hollow, the truth gets buried same as the rest. I asked him who they were, who gave the orders, who put my father in the ground, but he only shook his head again and whispered, "The ones who smile the most." Then he stood, knees cracking like gunshots, and started to walk away. But not before he paused and said almost gently, "Don't go back to the orchard, Clara. Some things don't want to be unearthed." I sat there long after he left, staring at the dirt beneath my feet like it might open up and speak. The sun had started to set behind the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the street. I clutched the bench with both hands to keep from trembling. My father had been closer to the truth than anyone knew, and that truth had cost him everything. But I wasn't done digging. I never was. Not now. Not after this. Whatever they buried, I would be the one to bring it back. The cabin sat where the trees grew thickest, hidden behind overgrowth and vines that seemed almost deliberate, as if the land itself had tried to swallow it whole after my father disappeared. The front door was rotted through, but the frame held like it had been waiting for someone to return. Inside, the air was stale and still, like no one had breathed here in years. Dust coated every surface, and the floor creaked like it recognized my steps. His books were still on the shelves, titles underlined and dog-eared, sermon notes tucked between pages, coffee rings marking the end of quiet mornings. I moved room to room slowly, touching nothing at first, until I reached the shed behind the cabin. Its latch rusted shut, and hidden beneath a tarp weighted with bricks. I knew the sound of something not wanting to be opened. I pried the door loose with a crowbar I found, leaning by the woodpile, and inside was a freezer, pale blue, humming faintly like it still had something to protect. It was bolted shut with 3 heavy chains and a padlock that didn't match the others, too new, too deliberate. I forced it open with shaking hands and sweat down my back, expecting death or decay or something worse, but there were no bodies, no meat, just files, ziplocked, vacuum-sealed, stacked in labeled bins like an archivist had packed them with care. I pulled one out and read the first page. Financial ledgers, names, shell accounts, payments routed through Black Hollow's church fund. Thousands of dollars. Then the school records, pages torn from attendance logs, names circled in red, children marked as transferred, who were never seen again. A list followed, handwritten in my father's cursive titled Confirmed Losses. Every name had a birth date and a last seen location. The last few names had only question marks next to them. I couldn't breathe right. It was like the truth had been cryogenically frozen, and now it was thawing too fast. I found photographs tucked in an envelope marked, "In case I'm gone." Some of them showed children on swings. Others showed the same children standing outside what looked like a school bus with the logo painted over. And then there were the signatures, contracts, agreements, everyone tied to names I now recognized from town. Mayor Linny Holt, Sheriff Eldon Maris, Principal Ray Kessler. I sank to the ground, knees on cold concrete, the edges of the bin pressing into my thighs. My father hadn't been paranoid. He had been preparing. He had collected every scrap of evidence he could before they caught up with him. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a system, a buried mechanism designed to grind the innocent into silence. I closed the freezer slowly, afraid even the wind might hear what I now knew. He had stored the truth in ice, because the truth burns when it breathes. And now it was alive again, in my hands, in my blood. In the town that thought it had buried him for good. The map in my father's journal wasn't detailed, not in the way you'd expect a trail to be marked, but something about the lines and symbols he had drawn told me he never meant for it to be easy, only possible. The roots of Black Hollow weren't in its soil but beneath it, and I followed the map's jagged arrows through a thicket behind the cemetery, down a ravine choked with moss and stone, until I found the mouth of something man-made carved into the side of the hill, half hidden by vines and decades of forgetfulness. The air inside was damp and metallic, the kind of cold that crawls into your ears and whispers that you should not be here. I ducked beneath a rusted gate, twisted open just wide enough for a body, and the tunnel swallowed me in silence. My boots echoed with every step, each one daring the darkness to answer back. The beam from my flashlight sputtered once, then steadied, catching glints of rusted rails embedded in the floor and old beams that held the ceiling like weary shoulders. It wasn't just a tunnel. It was a vein, pulsing with secrets no one wanted exposed. I moved deeper until the light flickered again and caught on something slumped near the wall. My breath caught. It was his satchel. The same one from the photos, leather worn at the edges and stained darker in one spot that I didn't want to name. I dropped to my knees and opened it with a whisper, afraid of what it might still hold. Inside were torn pages from his journal, his last entries cramped and rushed, some barely legible, others soaked in something that had dried into reddish-brown crust. One note simply said, "They found the door. Not safe. Not anymore." I turned slowly, and that's when I saw it. A wall at the far end, concrete, half-cracked, and smeared with something unmistakable. Blood, smudged and dragged like someone had tried to write with it, or maybe just leave a mark that screamed. And beside it, pressed into the grime, was a single fingerprint. Clear, sharp, larger than his, fresher than the rest. I didn't touch it. I didn't breathe. I just stared at it and felt something uncoil in my chest like panic dressed in recognition. He had been here, hurt, running, trapped, and someone else had been with him. Someone who left that mark like a signature or a challenge. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might echo off the walls. The tunnel groaned somewhere deep in its belly, like it remembered what happened here. I turned and ran, the flashlight swinging wild in my hand, the shadows snapping at my heels like hungry things. I didn't stop until the light from the outside kissed my face again. But even then, even in daylight, the truth clung to me like damp clothes. Black Hollow had a hollow of its own, and it was alive. I found the cassette buried beneath a false bottom in the satchel, wrapped in wax paper stained with time, labeled in a trembling hand that made my chest seize up the second I read it. "Play if I'm gone." My fingers trembled as I loaded it into the same battered tape player I had used in the attic, the one that still smelled like old wood and ghosts. And when I pressed play, his voice spilled out slow and low, like it was rising from beneath water. He sounded tired, older than I remembered, like the weight of knowing too much had bent something inside him that never straightened again. "If you're listening," he said, "then I didn't make it out. And you're not safe." My stomach clenched. I froze. The only thing louder than his voice was the pounding in my ears. "They'll come for the satchel," he said. "They'll come for you if they find out what you know. So listen to me, Clara. Please, listen." He named names then, one after another, like bullets sliding into a chamber. Sheriff Eldon Maris, Walter Knox, Mayor Linny Holt. He said they were part of it, that they had built their little kingdom on bones and silence. That every time someone asked the wrong question or followed the wrong path, they were either made to forget or made to disappear. He said Walter used to be different, used to care, but somewhere along the line fear got him, or guilt, maybe both. He said Maris kept the records clean and the roads blocked, and Linny smiled for the cameras while signing off on things no one was supposed to see. "I thought I could change it," he whispered. "I thought faith was enough. I was wrong." There was a pause then, just the hiss of old tape breathing. Then his voice returned, softer. "Clara, if this finds you, I am so sorry. I didn't want this for you. I wanted a quiet life, books, gardens, the kind of peace I never had. But you're the only one I trust. You're the only one who might finish what I started. Don't let them scare you. Don't let them bury you like they buried me." My eyes burned, but I didn't blink. I sat with that voice like it was the last warmth in a dying fire. "Protect the evidence," he said. "Tell someone who will listen. And if no one listens, make them." Then, just before the tape clicked to an end, he added almost like a prayer, "You were always the brave one." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of weight, of duty, of blood. I hadn't spilled yet, but knew I would. I took the tape out, wrapped it in the same wax paper, and tucked it into my coat like it was part of me now. My father hadn't left me with questions. He had left me with instructions, and I intended to follow every single one. I found Mayor Linny Holt in her office behind Town Hall, a room that smelled like lemon polish and carefully curated lies. Every book on her shelf turned spine out like a show of transparency that didn't fool me for a second. She was dressed in beige, not just the color of neutrality but of practiced detachment, and when she looked up from her desk, her smile was warm in the way of a campfire just before it turns. I told her I knew what she'd done, what this town had buried, what my father died trying to bring into the light. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Just leaned back in her leather chair like I was a curious child trying to talk about monsters under the bed. "Your father wanted to expose ghosts," she said with a calmness that made my teeth ache. "So we gave him one. A ghost with a name, a disappearance, a memory too foggy to follow. She said it like it was a favor, like Black Hollow had done him, the courtesy of vanishing him clean. I asked if it was her who signed off on the fake transfers, the missing children, the bank accounts tucked behind church walls, and she waved her hand like swatting away a fly she couldn't be bothered to see. "People want stories," she said. "They don't want mess." I told her I had the documents, the tapes, the maps, the freezer full of truth, and she tilted her head like a mother indulging a tantrum. "Do you?" she asked. "And how do you plan to use them when no one will listen?" I stood there, breath tight and fists clenched, knowing she was daring me to shout, to scream, to break just enough for her to call me unstable. So I didn't give her the satisfaction. I left without another word, but as I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, the air felt different, watched. I passed people on the street who had smiled at me days ago, and now their eyes slid past me like I had never arrived. The woman at the diner turned the sign to closed as I approached. The man at the gas station pretended not to hear me when I asked for directions. The librarian who once offered me tea now walked away with her head down, keys jangling like chains. It was coordinated, subtle. A performance of forgetting so rehearsed, it felt older than the town itself. Black Hollow wasn't going to fight me. It was going to erase me. Pretend I never stepped off that bus. Pretend my father never existed. Pretend no one had ever asked where the children went or why the orchard no longer bloomed. But I wasn't built to vanish. I was my father's daughter, and we don't disappear, not without answers. Not without leaving something behind louder than silence. And I was done being polite. Walter moved like a man walking through his own memories, slow and heavy, each step dragging something unseen behind it, As I followed him past the rusted gate of the cemetery and into the overgrowth where the stones leaned like drunks and the names had worn thin from rain and time. He didn't speak at first, just led me past the older graves, past the row of unmarked ones near the tree line, until we reached a patch of earth that looked no different than the rest, except for the way he stopped in front of it like it was sacred or cursed or both. The wind picked up and the trees creaked above us like old bones settling, but Walter's voice was soft, almost lost to the sound. "He didn't cry," he said, "not once. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just watched as his face folded in on itself, years of guilt cracking through the mask he wore like bark stripped off a tree. I didn't want to do it," he said, eyes on the dirt. "But Maris said if I didn't, it'd be my daughter next. Said they'd make it look like she drowned. Said they were cleaning up loose ends." His voice broke then, and he knelt, pressing his hand to the ground, like he was trying to feel a heartbeat that wasn't there. "I didn't know how deep to dig," he said. He was already bleeding, already fading. I think part of him wanted to go. My throat closed up, my knees locked. I wanted to scream, or hit something, or ask him why he didn't run, why he didn't hide my father, save him, fight back. But the truth was there, in his shaking hands and his hollow stare. He had been just scared enough, just broken enough, just like all the others in this town who whispered behind closed doors but never stood up. He reached into his coat and pulled out a rusted cross, the one my father used to wear around his neck, the one I hadn't seen since the last photograph. He placed it gently on the ground, like it belonged to the soil now. "I see him in my dreams," he whispered, telling me it's not too late. "But it feels too late, Clara. Every day it feels too late." He looked up at me then, eyes swollen and raw, and asked if I could ever forgive him. If saying it out loud counted for something. If telling me the truth after all these years made the ground any less heavy. I stared at him. This man who once said my name like it meant something, and I said nothing. Not because I couldn't, but because there was nothing left in me to offer him. Not grace, not rage, not closure, just silence. The same silence he gave my father when he shoveled the earth over his body, and I let it sit there between us like the grave he dug, cold, unforgiven, final. The sky was ink black by the time I returned, the kind of darkness that doesn't just settle but swallows, and the cemetery stretched out in front of me, like a secret no one wanted to remember. I brought only what I could carry in a backpack, a flashlight, a small shovel, gloves, and a plastic tarp, the kind you use when you know this isn't a rescue mission, just a reckoning. The ground where Walter had pointed felt colder than the rest, not in temperature but in something heavier, like the dirt itself knew what it was hiding and resented me for coming back. I dug in silence, each scoop echoing like a question I couldn't unask, the earth giving way slow, reluctant, like it had grown used to keeping him. I didn't cry. There was no space for crying, only rhythm. Dig, pause, breathe. Again. I hit something solid, just past the 3rd foot, a slab of wood warped by moisture and time. I scraped around it with shaking fingers until the edges were clear, then pulled it free with all the strength I had left. His face wasn't whole anymore, but it didn't need to be. The coat was still intact, the one from the photo, the collar stained, the buttons loose. His hands were folded across his chest, as if someone had tried to grant him peace even in betrayal, and between his fingers was an envelope wrapped in plastic. My name was written across it. Just Clara, nothing more, nothing less. And I opened it with the care of someone peeling back the final thread of a wound that never closed right. Inside was a single page, yellowed but dry, the ink still strong. "I knew you'd come," it read. "I only wish I could have seen the woman you became." My vision blurred, not from grief, but from the weight of finally being seen. If you're reading this, it means they buried me like I feared they would. But it also means you found your way. Keep going. Tell the truth. Make them look, make them answer, and above all, remember that I loved you more than I feared them. That was always true. I read the letter twice, 3 times, until the words no longer stung but settled somewhere behind my ribs like a flame that wouldn't go out. I placed it in my coat, laid the tarp over his body, and sat beside him for a long time, listening to the wind sift through the branches above. I had dug up more than bones. I had unearthed proof, grief, a piece of myself I had been too afraid to claim. The town could deny records, it could erase names, but it couldn't unbury this. Couldn't undo the dirt beneath my nails, or the letter in my coat, or the fury now moving steady through my blood. I had him now, in truth, in paper, in purpose, and I wasn't going to bury him again. I found Sheriff Maris in his office just past midnight. The walls too quiet, the air too still, like the whole town was holding its breath for what came next. He looked up when I walked in, not surprised, not afraid, just tired, like he'd known this was coming since the day he signed the first forged report and watched the first child disappear without raising a hand. I didn't speak at first. I just pointed the gun I had taken from my father's shed and held it steady, arms locked, heart galloping like it wanted out of my chest. Maris leaned back slowly in his chair, eyes fixed on mine, and said, "So the daughter finishes what the father couldn't." His voice was calm, almost bored. Like I was just another file he'd close before sunrise. I told him I had the tapes, the documents, the names, the blood, the fingerprints still waiting in that tunnel. He shrugged. Said evidence didn't mean much in a place where truth had no teeth. Said I'd run out of time the moment I stepped off that bus. I told him time had run out for Black Hollow. That it wasn't about getting justice the old way. It was about making the silence impossible. About turning the story loud enough to wake the dead. I backed him out of his office, down the corridor of the town hall, past framed photos of mayors and sheriffs who smiled from the wall like they were proud of their rot. The rain outside hit the windows like gravel, and thunder cracked once, close enough to shake the ceiling tiles loose. When we reached the main lobby, he stopped and asked if I was ready to do what my father couldn't. I didn't answer. I just stepped aside and lit the match. I had soaked the file room an hour earlier with gas siphoned from the mayor's car. Flames don't need permission. They only need space. And once they found it, the town hall lit up like a confession too long suppressed. Maris watched it for a moment, face glowing in the orange wash, then turned and walked toward the fire. I shouted for him to stop, to stay where I could see him, but he didn't. He vanished through the smoke, his shadow swallowed in heat and sparks, and whether he burned or escaped, I never knew. All that remained was ash, and the sound of sirens that came too late, and townspeople who gathered in silence, their eyes wide, their mouths closed, like they couldn't decide whether to mourn or bow. I dropped the gun in the mud outside and let the rain soak me to the skin. Let it wash off the soot, the blood, the 17 years of not knowing. Black Hollow wouldn't talk, but it would remember. Because fire speaks in ways paper never could. And whether I was savior or arsonist, I had finally been heard. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for reverence but earns it. The dew still fresh on the grass, and the sky cracked open just enough to let the sun bleed through. I wore the same boots I had dug with, the same coat that still held the letter against my chest, the same ache in my ribs that had settled there the night I heard my father's voice again. The unmarked patch of ground where Walter led me days ago had been cleaned now, the soil packed flat, the tarp removed, the truth finally allowed to breathe. The new headstone stood tall beside it, granite gray and simple, no crosses or flourishes, just his name and the words that had lived in my mouth since I read them on his tape. Reverend Thomas Hewitt, 1968 to 2008. He spoke the truth. I chose every letter, had them carved deep enough that no rain, no fire, no silence could wear them away. I stood there for a long time with my hands in my pockets and the wind playing with the strands of hair that wouldn't stay tied back. I didn't cry. There was no need. I had cried enough in basements and tunnels and attics filled with dust and bones and memory. Here, I stood. Not just as his daughter, but as the one who made sure he wasn't buried nameless. The one who put his story back on the map Black Hollow tried to erase. As I turned to leave, I saw Walter sitting on the far bench near the gate, his shoulders hunched under a coat too thin for the season, his hands clasped in his lap like he was waiting for something he didn't quite believe would come. I didn't wave, didn't speak. I just passed him slowly, the gravel crunching underfoot. And that's when I heard him, whispering, soft and steady, like the words had worn grooves into his throat from years of being rehearsed in dreams. She found him, just like he said she would. He didn't look at me, just kept staring ahead at the new headstone, his eyes glassy but not quite wet. I walked past, out the gate, and down the hill toward the road that would take me anywhere but here. The town was behind me now, but the echoes would follow. Some of them burned into the corners of my thoughts. Others folded into the satchel at my side. The freezer documents sealed and ready. The recordings duplicated and labeled. The truth would outlive Black Hollow. That was my promise. I didn't need vengeance or glory. I just needed to know he wasn't alone under the dirt, that someone finally named him, honored him, finished what he started. I reached the road and kept walking, not fast, not slow, just forward. My father's voice still warm in my ears. You were always the brave one. And this time, I believed him.